Gary will be our first speaker among the list of those who I'll have the honor of introducing today. He is Executive Director of Transparency International in the US. Prior to that, he led the FACT coalition. The FACT stands for Financial Accountability and Corporate Transparency, and his most recent co-authored article published this month in American Banker is titled just like for our today's event, Russian Oligarchs Hide Money in the US.
Thank you, Dmitry. Very much appreciate that introduction, and also want to sort of reiterate the support for our colleagues in Russia and TI chapters, quite frankly, around the world that are right now facing various struggles. I know that a year or so ago, we were involved in trying to help folks in TI Afghanistan leave the country because of concerns about their safety and elsewhere. So proud to be part of this terrific conversation today, and also glad we're doing this in honor of Russia and the TI colleagues around the world. My colleagues are going to talk a lot more about the influences with think tanks and universities and other ways in which money finds its way into the country to influence public policy. I want to talk about two things to sort of set the stage. One is, just so that we're all on the same page, is to talk a little bit about how money comes into the country in various ways, some of it public, but some of it private. And then the second is to talk about the use of authoritarian governments in hiring U.S. officials, former high-level U.S. officials. It is a growing problem, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But first, on how money comes into the country. So prior to people being sanctioned, or if they are not necessarily seen as a global pariah, but in fact have had there were concerns in their own country about how they accumulated their wealth, they can put money directly into the country. And as I said, my colleagues will talk a little bit about that. But there's also other ways in which money comes into the country that is very alarming, and that is when the money comes in through secret finance. And I want to spend a minute on how the use of anonymous shell companies has enabled bad actors from around the world to put money into the United States. In fact, Janet Yellen, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, last year testified in front of Congress that the U.S. is arguably the easiest place to launder money in the world. And that comes from a combination of several things. First of all, we provide secrecy. You can set up an anonymous company that no one knows who owns it through an agent or through other anonymous companies in offshore jurisdictions and put money into the United States without any questions being asked. You can buy real estate, you can invest in private investment markets, and money will come into the United States and no one will know it's there. It's one of the reasons that we had such problems tracking down sanctioned individuals and some of the Russian oligarch money after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So we have taken some steps in the right direction. A couple of years ago, the US Congress passed the Corporate Transparency Act. And starting next year, companies will have to report their, quote, beneficial owner, which is just a term of art, which means who really owns and controls, who's behind the company before you can actually set up a company in the United States. That is one significant step in the right direction. We need to do additional things in terms, including going after or providing enablers of or gatekeepers to the U.S. financial system with anti-money laundering and due diligence responsibilities. Banks, if somebody walks in, they have to find out who that customer is and is it somebody that they should be doing business with. But if you go to a lawyer, an accountant, somebody who sets up a trust for you, none of those questions are being asked, and people are able to inject money into this economy without anyone knowing. Let me flip to another part of the problem that I was going to talk about before, which goes directly to foreign influence. And here, there's growing concerns that former high-level ranking officials in the U.S. government are going to work for governments that we would consider to be either hostile or to raise concerns about their influence in the United States. There was a report that came out that since 2000, at least 90 former members of Congress were registered as foreign agents on behalf of 87 countries. Chinese interests in particular employed a number of those individuals. Several lobbied for a Chinese state-owned company that provides surveillance equipment and that is used to monitor the Uyghur populations. Others lobbied on behalf of an artificial intelligence company. Both companies have been blacklisted by the United States government, and yet members of Congress were working for those governments. We've also had former chairs of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee representing, some of them represented the embassy of Saudi Arabia. They played a critical role in trying to rehabilitate Saudi's reputation after the brutal murder of the Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi. We've seen additional generals and high-ranking military officials put their efforts and get hired by other countries, some of which may not be considered hostile to the United States, some of which may be allies, but still raise issues in terms of what those governments are trying to promote, including various arms sales. We had General Michael Flynn was actually convicted of covert influence peddling for Turkey. Turkish influence enjoyed a deep bench of former lawmakers doing legal work on their behalf, but nonetheless raised some questions. And these included former leader of the Democratic leader of the Senate, Tom Daschle, Representatives Bart Stupak, and a former Speaker of the House, Dick Gephardt. And so those raise a number of issues that we want to begin to take a closer look at. And so there's been several bills that have been introduced or are going to be introduced. We've seen some bills just calling for an outright ban for former senior officials from ever going to work for a foreign government. I think those some of those go pretty far, and it's unclear some of the reach of those bills. However, I think a new bill, bipartisan bill, is being worked on right now in Congress and hopefully will be introduced in the next couple of months, which would take a look at just the very senior officials, the most senior officials, cabinet level secretaries and just below, to say that there's a lifetime ban on them lobbying for what would be a list of hostile countries to the United States, and then extending the bans on them being able to use their influence with their former colleagues for a longer period of time. Right now, we see that bans or restrictions on their able to represent foreign interests is about a year. But a lot of firms, whether it be lobbying firms or other types of law firms, will be willing to put somebody on their payroll for a year to wait out that ban, and then they'll go back and lobby their former colleagues. So we think that we need to extend that. And the questions that we're negotiating right now are whether, is a 3-year restriction long enough? Should we make sure that it's at least one full administration, so you're literally not going back and lobbying your own colleagues that you worked with? There's at least a change in the administration. I think that seems a reasonable amount of time to have some of these restrictions in place. And so we'll see where that goes, but I think that we are beginning to see enough concern coming from former senior officials using their contacts, using their influence, using their knowledge, that we could get something done. The other thing is not actually even direct lobbying, but when you talk about some of the high-level ranking military officials and some folks in certain departments, the Homeland Security and others, they have specific knowledge about U.S. systems, and they will not necessarily be lobbying the U.S. government, but they will hire out their services to foreign governments to share information that might otherwise be considered classified. And so we want to take a look at that as well and making sure that there are appropriate protocols in place and permissions are given to the extent that it is allowable to make sure that we're not compromising our own security or that of our allies and friends around the world. So let me stop there. That gives you sort of a flavor for how money's coming in and some of the things we are concerned about our U.S. officials going and marketing their influence around the world to influence U.S. policy.